Today we're answering the question, why do we get cancer? And in order to understand why we get cancer, we have to understand cells. All living things are made up of cells. Our bodies are made up of trillions and trillions of them. And these cells are constantly growing, dividing, dying, and then being replaced by new cells that will grow, divide, and die. The reason that your eyeball is different from your liver is just because they are made up of different cell types. Eyeball cells in your eye, liver cells in your liver. And that's kind of an oversimplification, but not that much of one. There's this story in Greek mythology about the ship of Theseus, all right? And it was this ship, Theseus's ship, and they would take this ship on a journey every year. And as time went on, with each voyage that they went on, parts of the ship would fall into disrepair, would have to be fixed and replaced. And over time, over centuries, every single part of that original ship had been replaced. And so then the question is asked, is that ship still the ship of Theseus? And that's an interesting philosophical question. I think the answer, I don't know. But the point that I want to make is that each of us are really ships of Theseus moving through this voyage of life. If I look at my hand, this hand is not the same hand that it was 5 years ago. All of the cells that make up my hand are being replaced. Even the bones, what feels like a really sturdy, permanent fixture. The entire structure of the bone remakes itself every decade. So I'm on to my third, fourth version of this hand, which is pretty crazy. All of this cellular turnover requires massive amounts of cellular division. Deep inside our organs, stem cells divide over and over again to create hundreds of billions of new cells each day. This process, this rampant cell division, is what makes cancer a possibility, okay, for two reasons. The first is that cancer is a disease of uncontrolled cell division. And the fact that cellular division is so programmed into cells, it's such an essential part of their function, it means that almost every cell has the capacity to become cancer because almost every cell has the capacity to divide. And because that cellular division programming is so inherent to a cell, it means that in any given cell, it can go awry. The other reason is that cancer is a disease that occurs due to an accumulation of DNA mutations, okay? It's due to an accumulation of changes in the DNA that can occur over time. Anytime a cell divides, it has to make a complete copy of all its DNA. Copying something introduces the possibility of errors or changes. And so, every time a cell divides, it provides an opportunity for errors or mutations to be introduced into the DNA. So for these reasons, cellular division is inextricably linked to cancer. Let me try to go a little deeper and explain this a little more, okay? Here is a cell, and in the nucleus of the cell, we have the DNA. Now, the DNA is like a library. It's just a centralized location where all of the information that the cell needs is stored. The DNA has the instructions for life. It is the instructions that can tell a cell how to make any protein that it needs to make. Proteins are what determine cellular function. Every single cell in your body contains your unique library of DNA. It's not like different cells in your body that are different contain different DNA. They all have the same DNA. They all have all the information. The thing that makes cells different is just that certain cells activate different instructions from that library than other cells. And so, the cell in your eyeball is an eyeball cell because it has activated certain instructions that are in your DNA and has inactivated others. And then a different cell, although it has access to the exact same library, has activated and inactivated a different set of instructions, making it a completely different cell. So a cell in your heart activates a certain program of information and it becomes a cardiac myocyte. It responds to an electrical signal and it contracts in unison with all the other cells around it and makes part of a nice beating heart. On the other hand, cells that form the lining of your skin activate a completely different program. And they become these little cells that ultimately just flake off when you do something like this. They also flake off when you're sleeping, which is why you should wash your sheets regularly. And I'm looking at you, college-aged men, okay? An embarrassing story about me is that when I was a freshman in college, I actually didn't have sheets. I just brought a sleeping bag, and I just put the sleeping bag on the bed in my dorm and slept in that for an entire semester. And I'm not sure, but it's possible that I never even washed it one time, so I'm ashamed of that. Okay, DNA, this information library, is just a long chain of chemical code. And we call these long, distinct chains of DNA chromosomes. Regions of DNA on the chromosome that provide specific instructions to make specific proteins are called genes. So these genes are scattered across the chromosomes, and they are the instructions to make the proteins that are ultimately going to determine a cell's behavior. Now, as you could imagine, if there were any changes made to this DNA, it could have bad effects. And in fact, that is exactly what happens with cancer. We live in an environment that is constantly attacking our DNA. And so just naturally, the DNA in our cells can mutate or change as it interacts with the environment. The other thing is that when a cell divides, it has to make a copy of all its DNA. So right before a cell is going to split into two, instead of containing just one copy of all its DNA, it actually contains two full copies. It then divides into two cells, and then one full complement of DNA is packaged into each new cell. That way, every cell has access to the entire library of information. But this process of copying can also introduce changes. Sometimes the copy is not exactly right. And if that happens, it can sometimes lead to changes in cellular behavior. So, we get these errors or changes in DNA that are sometimes just randomly due to the environment, or are sometimes due to mistakes made during the copying of DNA that happens before a cell divides. But either way, sometimes changes to the DNA occur. Now, these changes occur randomly, and for the most part, these mutations have no effect on cellular function. But if you are just unlucky enough, you might get a mutation or change in one of your genes that ends up changing the protein that's made enough that it has a completely different function than what it had before. One mutation is not enough to cause cancer. But if that cell that has that mutation happens to be unlucky enough again to acquire another mutation in a different gene, and it changes the function of that gene enough that now you're making another protein that's acting in an abnormal way that it's not supposed to. And then you get another mutation in that same cell in a different gene. If this happens enough times, you can radically change the behavior of the cell. It can become cancer. And what it means to become cancer really means to become a cell that will divide uncontrollably. And so you have a cell. It has acquired through its life enough mutations that its cellular programming has been completely changed. And it now begins to divide uncontrollably. It starts as a single cell, divides into two, making a perfect copy of itself, copying those mutations that it acquired. So now we have two cells with those mutations. They will divide as well. They become 4. Those 4 become 8, then 16, then 32. And on these cells will divide and cluster together. And when we call that cluster of rapidly dividing cells a tumor. Now, you might be thinking, well, that's not so bad. You know, who cares if I have this cluster of cells that's just dividing within me? And the reality is, for a long time, it isn't so bad. Which is why, for years, cancer grows inside of people, and we have no idea. There are no symptoms, there's no way to detect it, but deep inside one of our organs, this tumor is growing, slowly, but persistently. Eventually, the tumor gets large enough that it starts to have some effect. You experience some symptom. And ultimately, what can happen is that the tumor can grow large enough that it can completely shut down whatever organ that it's growing in. But that's not the reason that people die from cancer. Most often, the reason people die is that these tumors don't just stay locally. While it's growing in whatever tissue it started at, many tumor cells are also released into the bloodstream. Most of them die, but some end up traveling to distant organs, seeding themselves there, and starting to grow new tumors in these distant sites. This is called metastasis. And this is what is so deadly, because then even if we can remove that original tumor, the seeds are spread throughout the body. Those will continue to grow. It becomes impossible to find them all and remove them all, and eventually they start to grow, take over multiple organ systems, shutting them down, ultimately resulting in death. This is the devastating story of cancer. So, to review. Our bodies are made of cells, and cells divide a lot. Anytime a cell divides, it creates an opportunity for cancer. Because when a cell divides, it has to copy all of its DNA. And anytime it has to copy its DNA, it introduces the chance for errors or mutations to arise. At the same time, just living and breathing and moving through the world introduces our cells to environments that can cause mutations just randomly on its own, and there's nothing we can do about it. These changes in our DNA, these mutations, happen randomly, but if you are extremely unlucky, you can get a combination of mutations all within a single cell that will send that cell on a program of uncontrolled cell division. It will continue to divide and it will form a tumor. What is especially deadly is when those tumors send seeds out to different organs in the body. Once your tumor has metastasized, it becomes exquisitely difficult to try to remove that from your body. But there is hope, and there are new treatments, and we are learning more and more each day. And hopefully one day, cancer will not be the terrifying word that it is today.